Hi guys, thanks for tuning in. My name is Scoobulus and I'll be your host today. You can call me Scoob. And I'm making this video as an inspiration from someone that had an experience with this yesterday that was a new player. This might not be the most interesting video to watch, but what I can tell you is that if you're a new player to Elite Dangerous, this is something that I think you should pay attention to. Today we're going to talk about key bindings. It's a very important aspect of the game. There's a lot of stuff to do with your keyboard and with your control inputs, and it's important that you take them into consideration. So let's get into it. So I've already got the game loaded up, and we're going to take a look at, whoops, that's not what I wanted to do. I'm going to go into options before we even get into the game. If you're a new player, you need to go into options and under controls. And this needs to be the first thing you need to do. Now I'm going to go over my control inputs. I'll talk a little bit about how I have mine set up and why. I'm going to talk about what things you can skip because they're available in a menu, what's high priority, what's low priority, and hopefully this will help you out. So the first thing to notice is there's a lot of categories in these, and there's a lot of things under each of these categories. Some of them are longer than others, but the important thing to remember about all these different categories is that some of them are going to put your game into a different state where you're going to control a different vehicle or have a different control set, so some of these controls can overlap. But if you do nothing else, you should be setting up your flight controls. If you can't fly your ship, or drive your SRV, or fly your fighter, you can't play the game. If you can't take off and land and get out of a starport safely in an intuitive way where the controls make sense to you, the game is going to be useless and frustrating to you, and you're going to give up after you paid full price for it. And that's not anything anybody wants. Now you'll notice up here mine says custom. You've got a lot of presets on here. You can clear them out by going to empty. Do a generic joystick setup, keyboard and mouse setup, keyboard and mouse with yaw, and there's even a preset for the Thrustmaster T16000M FCS. Now I've gone with custom. It's saying T16000M because that's the control set I have, but you can go to custom and set this up. Actually, custom will appear after you start setting these up, but I started with a blank slate and put this stuff in here that made sense to me. Now, again, I have the T16000M flight pack with the rudder pedals, so I've got like 13 axes to work with. But the important thing to remember about this particular setup is even if you don't have rudder pedals, you can do the yaw in a different way with a stick. The stick has a twist axis on it, and you can control your ship's yaw like this. So let's dive into this. Let's start talking about this. First thing on the menu here is the mouse controls, and sorry about these being grayed out. I don't know why it does that, but the x-axis is just as if you had shaken your head no, and if you're doing this with mouse and keyboard, you're going to want to set this to yaw because that makes the most sense. It's again, the yaw, if you're not familiar with flight controls, it's just like shaking your head, like saying no to somebody. It's going to rotate your ship sideways horizontally, but not roll your ship. The relative mouse axis is kind of hard to explain, but anytime you have a relative axis in this game, especially with the mouse, it has to do with the degree of deflection that you're using. You want that turned off, and with it turned off, what it's going to do is behave just like a mouse cursor. So you will have to move your mouse from center to make a control input, and you'll have to move your mouse back to center to stop that control input. With relative axis on, it means that axis is going to center if your mouse is sitting still. No input, no deflection, and you'll stop turning. And that's not very intuitive for a mouse to do in a ship. The y-axis basically works the same way. This should be pitch. It's probably going to work best for a new player as regular pitch instead of pitch inverted. And pitch inverted is something that's going to work best for a joystick player that's an avid flight sim enthusiast, because that's the way an aircraft works. But for a mouse, up is up, down is down. That's probably the most intuitive thing. You can also bind a key input to recenter the mouse automatically. That's optional, but I'm going to get into something that's going to help you out too. Here you can set your sensitivity and your mouse relative rate, and that's how fast it's going to come back to center. You can also instill a dead zone in the mouse, just like you would if you had a joystick. Power curve, I'm not a mouse and keyboard player, so I haven't really experienced this, but this will accelerate the mouse. So you have the faster you move, the faster your input changes. But the most important thing about mouse and keyboard is this right here. If you're using KBAM, or keyboard and mouse, turn that widget on, and that's going to put a dot in the center of your HUD, and it's also going to put an arrow so that when you move your mouse off of center, it's going to show you where your input is. It's going to tell you what direction you're moving your ship. You can physically see what your input's going to do in your HUD in real time. It's like a mouse cursor, but it's going to change angle and basically show you which way you're going to be turning your ship. It's a very useful thing for KBAM players to use. So if you're using mouse and keyboard, turn this on, this mouse widget. It's really going to help you. Now, the most important thing, if you do nothing else in here, set up your flight controls, guys. This is going to be the base, the foundation of the game is flying a spaceship. And if you can't point it in the right direction accurately, you're never going to get out of space dock. You're going to get your butt shot down, and it's going to frustrate you. So we'll start with the yaw axis. Now for me, this is reading as joystick V axis, and the reason that is because I'm using a set of rudder pedals and they plug into the throttle. If you're using a standard joystick of any kind, or just the T16000M, or any joystick with a twist axis where you can actually twist the stick, that's going to show up as joystick Z axis. And you generally want to have that as a regular axis and not inverted, unless you're really feeling saucy and like a southpaw, but there's no reason to invert that axis. So to yaw left, I've also got keyboard inputs on this to yaw left and yaw right because of voice attack. Voice attack is something I use in the background, and it's a macro execution utility for those of you who aren't familiar with it. And the profiles that go with it from HCS voice packs dictate that you need to have certain keybinds set in order for this to work correctly. If it doesn't see a keybind, it's going to generate a missing keybind report and tell you all the stuff that you could be missing and that those commands aren't going to work right. But yaw is one of those things that if I were using a keyboard, I'd be using the number pad to navigate with helm controls and use my pitch, roll, yaw, and drive controls. And num1 and num3 intuitively would act like a pair of rudder pedals in my right hand. And that's why those are set this way. I don't typically use these for helm controls. I use the joystick. But if it weren't for voice attack and some of its audacious requirements for key bindings, I wouldn't even have these set. Now, it doesn't do any steering for you, but it's just out of posterity's sake that I have these set, just as an alternate set of flight controls. Yaw into roll is something, I mean, you read the description, it starts to roll, or it starts to yaw before you roll. It's sort of a combination movement. And I haven't ever found a use for it. I just want my control inputs to do exactly what they're supposed to. But some people might find this useful or even comfortable to turn this on. It just depends on your taste. There's a sensitivity adjustment that goes with it. And there's also a setting of behavior, how it performs with flight assist turned off. We'll get into flight assist in a little while, but basically your ship's going to have it turned on by default to make controlling your ship easier. Now, the yaw roll button, you can actually switch the input from yaw to roll by entering a keybind here. Again, I've got inputs for everything. I don't find this particularly necessary. But if you're short on inputs, it might help you to have a button bound to this to change one of your inputs. There's a plus button next to this, and you can also change this between a toggle and a hold. So you can use it as like a shifted input if you're using that. For me, my roll axis is on my main joystick. That's the X-axis, left and right. I've got numpad 4 and 6 bound to the individual inputs on the number pad for keyboard control. Likewise, the pitch axis is on my joystick's Y-axis, and that is inverted. Like I said, this is how a real aircraft is controlled. You would pull the stick towards you to get the nose to go up, and you'd push it away from you to get the nose to go down. So this is inverted. And likewise, I've got numpad 2 to pitch up, in similar fashion to the stick, and numpad 8 bound to pitch down. All these pluses have the dead zone associated with axes. The next thing you're going to want to set up is the flight thrust. So you've got your attitude controls. Now we need to be able to move you forward and back, and that's what these are for. The lateral thrust axis is to be able to step your ship sideways without changing your attitude. And for me, this says joystick X-axis, but let's keep in mind that this is the X-axis on the mini stick that's on my throttle. If you didn't have a throttle next to you, or a HOTAS for that matter, or you're just using a standard joystick, you could put your left hand on the keyboard and think of this as kind of like a first-person shooter, where you would strafe left and right using your A and D keys. And the axis is going to be regular, just like usual. Let's also keep in mind that this particular mini stick on the back of my throttle is oriented vertically. It doesn't sit horizontally with my desk. It's vertical. It's actually perpendicular to the surface of my desk. So the vertical thrust axis, similar to the y-axis on the main stick, for me, it's going to be inverted. I want to pull that button upwards toward the ceiling, and I want the ship to rise. And likewise, when I push the button down, I want the ship to move toward its belly, toward the landing pad, if you will, if it was above the, if it was trying to be docked. So this stick is going to be inverted. If it were regular, up would be down and down would be up in its current orientation. Likewise, if you're still missing the throttle, you can use your W and S keys to establish vertical movement in your thruster. So now you're combining your left hand with your stick movements, and this can work pretty well, especially if you're in a mouse and keyboard setup. You can strafe and change your attitude with the mouse. You might also be able to use your pinky keys in some of your yaw movements to, well, actually your mouse would be controlling your yaw, but you can use your Q and E keys alternatively to roll the ship if you need to while using the W, A, S, and D commands in a mouse and keyboard setup. Thrusting forward and backwards, if you've got a joystick, you've pretty much assured to have a throttle. Even something as old as the Logitech Wingman Extreme 3D or whatever it's called. I can't remember the full name of it. I think it's an Extreme 3D. And even something that's that old is going to have a throttle on it. The T16000M does have a throttle slider on the stick. And for my purposes, I don't have it bound to much of anything useful because I've got the throttle in my left hand. So that's reading as the RZ axis. But if you were going to put this on the joystick, this would show up as the joystick U axis. And that was on my main stick that I just set there. I'm going to set this back up to the... Actually, that's wrong. This is what I want the thrust forward and back, so we don't want that. I want this to be the... what this particular control refers to is your lateral, vertical, and horizontal movement. So this is if you were to blip the thrusters, just like with that mini stick. This isn't your throttle right here. So thrusting forward and backward, you would probably have 2 more keys assigned to this as well. Again, VoiceAttack doesn't require this for me, so I don't have any key bindings set up. I've got this axis set up, and I have a throttle axis set up, so I don't need to bind these. If you're using a keyboard and mouse setup, you may find this useful to blip the thrusters real quick at 100%, just to sort of nudge yourself forward or back. It's also helpful to have a reverse bound so you can get to it easily and move backwards without too much of a hassle. It's also useful if you're running on a standard joystick to have keybinds bound to these two, because that throttle isn't always convenient as it would be on a HOTAS just to have the whole thing in your hand. So moving on from flight thrust, if you set nothing else up, flight rotation, flight thrust, these are going to get your movement down, and everything else can come later, but that will get you flying. So alternative flight controls, don't worry about these, guys. If you're a new player, you do not need this. This comes up when alternate flight controls are toggled. If you have a real elaborate control setup, this is something you might want to think about, but for new players, you want to ignore this category and don't bind anything to it. Flight throttle is all by itself because there's a lot to it. There's a lot of speed settings in here, and a lot of it isn't necessary. Again, I've got these bound for VoiceAttack because there are commands that change the throttle in 10% increments. There are also macros to go from -100 all the way to +100 in 25% increments, and those have keybinds associated with them directly. So while all these are largely unnecessary, there's one that's really going to help you. When you're in Super Cruise and you're approaching your destination, this 75% one right here, you should bind something to it because that's going to get you at a safe speed to drop out of Super Cruise when you approach your destination. If you're going any faster than this, you're going to fly right past it and damage yourself as you jump out. So you should be setting it to 75% or less as you approach your destination. Having a keybind associated with that makes it very easy to do that. The rest of these are largely unnecessary unless you have VoiceAttack. But if you're using a keyboard, if you're using a joystick, the throttle axis, again, I've got mine set up to the big throttle on the left. You can also set this up to the U axis on the joystick. And for me, this shows up as inverted because of the way the potentiometer is oriented. For the T16000M, this is correct, but your joystick may vary. If you find your throttle goes in the opposite direction or does something backwards from what you want, you can change this setting and get it to work right. Your throttle axis range, for me, I've got this set to forward only because I've got the paddle on the back of this throttle set up to blip the thrusters in reverse. I've also got this button bound, which shifts the ship into reverse, and then pushing the throttle forward will activate the reverse thrusters. I don't typically find this necessary, but the keybind is there just for convenience sake, and so I have that to use. It's also beneficial to have this sort of setup on the SRV if you don't have rudder pedals. We'll get into the SRV setup in just a little bit. I've got more axes bound to that make use of the rudder pedals toe brakes, but I'll talk about that in just a minute. In the meantime, if you've got your standard joystick, this could be a useful keybind for you. And it's similar just to taking your foot off the gas in your car, holding the brake, shifting into reverse, and then blipping the gas again to get your vehicle to go backwards. Similar fashion to this. You should bind something to it. For the keybinds for voice attack, I've got this bound over here to shift backspace. I've got increments and decrements to my throttle also bound to the plus and minus keys on the number rack. Now, this isn't the most intuitive thing, but keep in mind I've got axes bound to this and other keybinds down here, and that's there specifically for voice attack. The rest of this stuff down here is bound because voice attack exists. If you have a control stick or an axis of some sort to bind this to, all you need is this bind right here, and possibly that key right there. That's all you need. Don't let the rest of this intimidate you. For landing overrides, you really don't want your ship to function any differently than it already does when your landing gear is down versus having your landing gear up. You can change the way your ship flies in a landing configuration, but you really don't want to do that. So if you're a new player, don't worry about binding any of these. This is a completely unnecessary category for a new player. Under miscellaneous, you've got some utilities, and we'll talk about utilities in particular as we go through this. But here's one of the most interesting features of Elite Dangerous right here, Flight Assist. I can tell you this, guys, some of the most dangerous players in the game use a mixture of Flight Assist off and Flight Assist on. And I want to cover the difference real quick with this because it's important to the nature of your flight controls. So your ship's going to work on Newtonian physics, but your Flight Assist is going to help you with your inputs. With Flight Assist on, the easiest way I can explain this is in similar fashion to how an Airbus joystick works. If you've never seen the cockpit in an Airbus, you might not know what I'm talking about, but to simplify it, it means this. When your stick is centered, you are commanding a 0-degree rate of change. You are not commanding the pitch to change. You are not commanding the roll or the yaw to change. So as long as it's centered, it's commanding 0 change in trajectory. As you move your stick, it's commanding a rate of roll or a rate of pitch or a rate of yaw. And once you take your hand off of it again, it returns to 0. The computer will do whatever is necessary to the thrusters to get your ship to stop moving by firing inverse thrusters to get your ship to stop doing what it was doing while you had your hand on the stick. With Flight Assist off, if you move your stick, you fire your thrusters. If you return your stick to center, none of your thrusters are firing, and your ship is going to continue doing what it was doing before. And you have to counter thrust in order to get it to stop moving again. So you have to input counter movements in order to get your roll to stop or your pitch to stop or your yaw to stop. And you have to make throttle inputs to get your ship to move in the direction that you want with Flight Assist off. There are some players that do this exclusively, but the most dangerous ones are going to do it with a mixture of Flight Assist on because it can correct your ship's movement very easily with it on and then turn it back off again. This way here, you can move in one direction and aim in another. So it's a very important feature, and it's an advanced flight technique. For new players, I would recommend leaving this on, but do bind a key to it. For me, I've got one of my joystick buttons bound to it, and for me, this is on the upper right-hand corner of my, the lower right-hand corner of the T16000M. I've also got a keyboard bound to it. This is on the numpad. The dividing key is going to toggle that for me. That's there for voice attack. The engine boost is pretty simple. You're going to get a burst of speed out of your thrusters. It's pretty common to use this. Do bind something to it. I've also got a keyboard input for voice attack. And this goes for mouse, keyboard, anything, bind something to it. If you're using keyboard and mouse, you're obviously going to want to bind this to something that's in your left hand rather than in your right hand because your right hand is going to be on the mouse. But for me, if I'm flying with just a keyboard, this is something I would use. Frameshift drive toggling is another point of interest. I've got my primary usage of my faster than light drive And I've got keybinds obviously here for voice attack, just like before, but I've got them separated. I want to be able to toggle my Super Cruise drive and toggle my hyperspace jump function separately from one another. My hyperspace jump is going to be on my thumb in my right hand. In my left hand. And in Super Cruise, I've got this rocker on the back of the throttle that's going to be bound. I pull that up to toggle the frameshift drive. Your frameshift drive toggle is where you would use this if you were short on keybinds. And by default, this is the default key binding is going to be J to jump, obviously. And it depends entirely on what you have targeted as to what it's going to do. So if you're on thrusters, and you just came out of a station, and you don't have another system or any other destination targeted, once you're out of mass lock, if you tap your J key, you're going to go into Super Cruise. Likewise, if you're in Super Cruise and you don't have anything targeted, you will drop out of Super Cruise, provided you're going slow enough. Double tapping, it's going to do an emergency stop. If you have another system targeted, you'll initiate a hyperspace jump to that system instead of toggling your Super Cruise drive. And that goes for thrusters or on Super Cruise. So it depends entirely on what you have targeted as to how this button is going to function. I don't typically use it, but voice attack will, based on what's targeted. For the rest, the orbit lines, let's see, rotational correction. Rotational correction is the correction that your ship assumes when you get into a rotating body like a station. Stations rotate to simulate gravity. And when you go inside, you'll find that once you're inside, everything is stable and it's not going to rotate around you. But if you turn this off, you'd get a more realistic feel of what it is to be a fixed point in space because you're not attached to anything and the station's just going to spin around you. That makes it much more difficult to land, and there shouldn't be any reason for any sane person to turn this off. The only reason you would want to do this is if you're trying to challenge yourself with flight assist off and doing completely manual dockings, free from any assistance from the computer. I still wouldn't bind this to a key, but this option is available in the menu system on the right-hand panel under Ship. You can turn this off at your leisure, but it's not something you want to have a keybind easily accessible to. The orbit lines is the same kind of deal. I've got a keybind set to it again for voice attack because it doesn't require it, but it recommends there be a keybind filled into it. But it's not necessary to bind anything to it. Again, it's available in the menu under Ship on your right-hand panel. As for targeting, targeting is a big deal in this game. It doesn't matter if you're targeting another ship, a wake to try to jump into or out of Super Cruise or hyperspace, or if you're chasing somebody, if you're targeting a planet, you're targeting an object. Targeting is everything. You need to select what you want in this game to do anything with it. By default, selecting the target that you are looking at and what is highlighted by virtue of where your ship is pointed is T. I've got that bound for voice attack. But I also have this bound, if you have a stick, I've got this bound in my right hand to my thumb. It's apart from my primary fire and secondary fire, so that's going to be my third button. That's to the left of the POV hat. This is a very important function. You can point at something, look at it, and target it, and that can be exceptionally useful. Cycling through your targets, while it's not necessarily going to cycle through hostiles, this will cycle through every ship, not necessarily objects, on the page. You want this if you're trying to scan a ship or a group of ships for crafting data. And if you do this, you cycle through your targets in such a way where you're going to be able to make sure that you don't scan something that you've already scanned. It's not going to go in any particular order by distance or alphabetically or whatever, but you will cycle through your targets in an ordinal fashion, which allows you to make sure that your next target hasn't already been scanned. And I'm just talking about a basic scan here to go get crafting data. Those are bound to the bracket keys for me. I don't typically use them, but when I do, at least I have something that makes a little bit of sense to reach with a right-hand component and a left-hand component that means go next or go previous. So to me, that makes a little bit of sense. I don't have it bound to the joystick just to cycle through targets because I have other cycling functions assigned to the joystick, which we're going to get into in just a second. The highest threat for me is going to be on the left side of my joystick. All of the buttons on the left side of my joystick are dedicated to targeting. And one of these is going to be the inside button that's going to target the highest threat. This is the person that's causing the most damage to me. And it's also bound to a key, so voice attack can have that function as well. Doesn't matter if you use mouse and keyboard, you should bind highest threat to a key somewhere on your keyboard. Next hostile is also going to be the button directly beneath it. actually above it. This one's on the bottom right of my arrangement of keys on the left side of my joystick, and this one's going to be on the top right. So next hostile is going to be... no, I take that back. These two here are going to be in the middle. I'm sorry. I'm having trouble remembering my own keybinds. So my highest threat's going to be the upper right hand on the left side of the stick, and these next two, next and previous hostile, are going to be the up and down keys in the middle of those arrangements of keys. For the keyboard, voice attack is going to pick this up as H and Shift H in order to do next and previous. For hostile, and it makes sense. I'm associating the same key to do next and previous with a shifted input. That's something you might want to think about as well. This goes for keyboard, mouse, standard stick, HOTAS. It's not bad to bind a keyboard input to this, but you want a next and previous one on your stick as well. Targeting is important, especially if you're in combat. You need to do it quickly. Now these next keybinds these next keybinds hail from when I used to play Star Trek Online. There was some teammate selection, and you could even select yourself. Some of the things you could cast on yourself, and you would need to select yourself in order to keep from casting it on somebody else on purpose. Now, you can't select yourself in this game. If you were going to do that, if you're going to like put a limpet out or something to repair you, you would deselect all of your targets and make sure your targeting is clear, and your limpet would default to help you rather than a selected teammate. But if you're going to select your teammates, this is important. You can have 3 additional teammates in a wing for a total of 4. So your first, second, and third teammates, I bound to F1, F2, F3. The next keybind also hails from Star Trek Online from a default keybind that was in there, and that is the key Y. I've got that bound to a joystick button as well, to button number 8, which is the lower right of the left arrangement of buttons to the left of the stick on the base. Wingman's target is important because if they're shooting at something important, you want to be able to select your wingman with one of your F keys real quick and then come down and pick up their target. The keybind makes sense to me because its default in Star Trek Online when I used to play that was had a function similar to attack my target or target target's target, and that's what Y was bound to. Now, we're not talking about the attacker, we're talking about the target. There is a difference. Navlock is the other thing. This is accessible from a menu, and you may not make a lot of friends right off the bat when you get into the game, but if you're going to navlock somebody, you want to use a keybind for that. I've got one set up for voice attack, but it's also accessible from the comms menu when you're dealing with your friends. What a navlock does is it slaves your FSD to theirs, and the best practice for this, when they jump, you jump. That's how it works. But the best practice is to set for everybody else in the group, anybody else in the group, to set their navlock to the person with the shortest jump range. That way they plot the route, they lead the group, and no one leaves anybody else behind. Everybody jumps together. But again, it slaves your FSD to somebody else. When they drop, you drop when you're in range of their wake. When they jump, you jump from thrusters or from supercruise. And you follow their wake, and by being navlocked, you don't need to press any buttons to initiate your jump. It will do that automatically. Your subsystems targeting is also a feature in this game. I've got keybinds associated with it. For me, the period and comma work because they are greater than, less than. Again, another one of those symbols on the keyboard that symbolizes next or previous. I'm going to take a sip of water here, guys. Apologies. I've also got this on the joystick so I can cycle through them quickly. I can fly at a set thrust and also use these with my left hand in order to get my subsystem targeting where they need to be. You'll cycle through a ship's subsystem. Now, keep in mind that every targetable subsystem and every hardpoint and every utility mount is going to show up in this cycle. So the smaller the ship, the faster you're going to get through the loop of subsystems. If it's a big ship like an Anaconda or a cutter, you're going to be cycling through a lot of different things. Or if you have a Challenger or a Chieftain or something with 4 engines on it, you're going to have 4 drives before you pass all their engines. So your list size is going to change as you're cycling through these. But do have a couple of keybinds for these. It's very helpful when you're trying to select a subsystem, and it keeps you from having to go into the left menu. But if you don't want to do these, you don't have to. You can see your target in your contacts menu to your left, and then if you go to subtargets, you can pick the subsystem that you want to lock onto with your ship. Targeting next system en route is if you have a route plan to get somewhere that takes more than one jump, you have a button that's dedicated to targeting the next system. So you don't have to go over to your navigation panel and select it manually. I've got that bound to the rocker switch in the opposite direction as toggling my Super Cruise drive. That doesn't make a ton of sense, but it does to me. It seems to work well for me. Alternatively, I have it bound to a keyboard shortcut because Voice Attack is also going to use this as one of its macros. So Right-Alt-J makes sense from a keyboard standpoint because we're already using J as a toggle for the frameshift drive to initiate a hyperspace jump. So Alt-J is going to be associated with selecting the system that you're actually going to jump to, so why not put it on the same key? As far as weapons goes, it goes without saying that your trigger is going to be your primary fire if you have a joystick. If you're using a mouse, I strongly recommend binding your left mouse button if you're right-handed, or your primary mouse button, whichever hand you're using, to this. I've also bound that to space to fire the weapons. Secondary fire, joystick 2, no question, middle of the top of the stick, and left shift space is going to be my alternate keyboard shortcut for that. You don't have to bind these to the keyboard if you've got a mouse or if you've got a joystick, but it's in either case, you don't want these unbound. Alternatively, these two keys right here are going to confirm or cancel a selection in a menu. So you're going to use these to navigate just as well as you would to fire your weapons. Cycling your next fire group, you notice there's a next and previous down here. In a later video, I may show you about fire groups and how to assign them. But really, if you've got more than 3 fire groups, you've got too much stuff. You can consolidate some of this stuff into a single fire group using the same key for it. And it, again, will depend on what target you have selected as to which utility or which scanner that you're going to be using with it. So you only really want to cycle through them forward on a joystick. Don't waste your keybinds. You can cycle through and go back to the beginning of the list just by blipping the same button more than once. But if you need to, next and previous can be assigned to the keyboard, and I've got these set for Voice Attack. Hardpoint, same deal. I've got a keyboard shortcut bound for Voice Attack, but you should, of course, have one bound to your joystick. Now, this is an important feature underneath here. Firing deploys hardpoints. This means if you press one of your primary or secondary firing buttons, it will automatically open up your weapons bay and deploy your weapons. I typically turn this off. You don't want that feature coming out accidentally when you're trying to do wake scans near the station, and that's wake scanner is going to be bound to a fire group. So you don't want your weapons out. You don't want to go rock out with your cock out near a station because it presents a hostile posture which can get you hurt. As a new player, you're going to wonder what happened and why if you have your weapons out and you accidentally fire them near a station. You're going to collect fines. You're going to be hostile, wanted. If you hit somebody accidentally, you could get yourself shot down and destroyed by a station. Stations don't mess around, so leave this setting turned off unless you have a good reason for using it. Otherwise, if you get to be a more advanced player and you have a preference, you can turn it on, but if you're a new player, I would really advise turning this off. As for cooling, this is a very simple category. You've got silent running, which closes heat vents on your ship and reduces your heat signature to your target and makes you unable to be locked on. But as that's happening, your ship's going to build up its heat internally. I know it doesn't conform to the laws of physics, but when that happens, you can deploy a heat sink. A heat sink is an aluminum block that can be launched out of one of your utility mounts. And when that happens, all of your heat gets dissipated and it goes down to 1 or 2% and stays there for a little while before it starts to build back up again, or until you turn off silent running and your heat levels dissipate and return to normal. Now, this is a utility, and you can bind this to a fire group, but I strongly advise against it, not only because they give you a dedicated keybind for that, but if you have more than one heatsink launcher, which you can do to get more ammunition out of it, binding this to a fire group is going to launch all of the heat sinks that you have bound to that fire group if you have more than one. Now you can, cycle your launchers through manually, or you can put multiple launchers in different fire groups if you want, but that just creates a big hassle. Why do all that when you can have a dedicated key for it or a dedicated joystick button for it? And even though you can bind it to a fire group, it's not going to be on your primary or secondary fire buttons ever. You can save some of your cycling by just binding this to a key that makes sense. For me, I've got it on the joystick. It's going to be on the right side with the rest of my utilities. It has nothing to do with targeting, so it's going to be on the opposite side. Again, I've got that bound to delete. It's on the bottom of the cluster of 6 keys above the arrows, so that makes sense to me because it's going to basically poop out a heatsink. Insert, obviously the vents are on top of the ship, so the key that's on top of that cluster is going to toggle my silent running. But voice attack also requires these two to be bound, and there is an emergency protocol that you need to speak a very long phrase with a prefix in order to get this to work, because it's such a big deal to turn this on and forget about it. So you want to be sure about what you're doing. Silent running can also be set to be toggled or held as long as you've got a key depressed. I prefer toggle on this, but you can set that to your preference. Under miscellaneous, not everything's got to have a joystick binding to it. Let's talk a little bit about this. Your ship does have headlights. You will get into some dark planets where you can't see where you're going, so you're going to need some lights, and I bind that to the L key. I don't have it bound to a joystick key because it's typically not so important, and the things that you come across are usually going to be lit on one side or another by the star that you're nearby. Even if you're an exceptional distance out into the solar system, you're typically going to have a lot of light from the star. Now, I'm currently doing a run to a station that's near a planet that isn't getting any light from its star, and it's a gas giant, but that's not typical. And when you come across that, in Super Cruise, this is useless. This is only within a few hundred meters of your of like a surface that can reflect. So if you're like right next to a station or right next to an installation or right next to the ground or right next to your landing pad, is this going to light up? So it doesn't work at extraordinary distances. You're not going to see something way, way, way far ahead, kilometers away with lights. So this is only useful at close range, and most of the time you're going to be at 1 kilometer or more away from what you're dealing with under normal flight conditions. So I bind this to the keyboard only and not to the joystick. It's important, but it's not that important. Sensor zoom axis, I've got a dial on my joystick's throttle, on the HOTAS throttle that allows me to change this. And for me, it's correct to have this inverted in order to push it forward to zoom in and move it backwards toward me to zoom out. That just happens to be the way the potentiometer works, and this is the default setting. You can look at that when you're calibrating your joystick. If something's pulled all the way back and the field is filled up, you probably want an inverted setting. But like always, if it doesn't work the way you intend, you can change this setting and get it to work the opposite direction. If you don't have a joystick or an axis to bind that to, you can, of course, put that to keyboard shortcuts. So page up, page down, that's what I've got that bound to for me. Power distribution is also very important in this game, and I've got this set to the most obvious thing you can. If you look at the arrangement in your HUD for your power distribution, your engines are going to be on top, your weapons are going to be on the right, your subsystems are going to be on the left, and the balance power button is going to be on the bottom. And that looks to me like the cluster of arrow keys. So we use the arrow keys to manage those accordingly. I've also got a 4-way hat switch on the joystick, which are numbered according to how it appears on the joystick. And that's where I do those. So up, down, left, and right on that button, on that hat switch respectively, is what's going to do that for me with my left hand. But if you're using a keyboard, this is how I would manage it if I were you. This makes the most sense. Resetting HMD orientation has to do with if you're playing VR. I've only got this bound because voice attack screams at me if I don't, but you don't have to have this unless you have VR. And it's entirely up to you. If you can afford a VR headset, chances are you've got a HOTAS. Bind this to something on your joystick that's easy to get at, so when you straighten out your head to a comfortable position, you can punch this button and get your view centered so where it's comfortable for where you're looking. That's what this is for. Cargo scoop, also important. You're going to be using this quite often, especially as a new player, to scoop up materials and cargo. I've got a keyboard binding for it, and I've also got a joystick binding for it. But even keyboard mouse players should have a keyboard binding to this. You can get to this in the menu, but it really is worth it to have this out on a key binding. Jettison all cargo. Guys, put gaffer tape over whatever key you are using for this, or don't bind it at all. For me, I do not need voice attack to do this, and I don't believe there is a command to jettison all cargo for voice attack, but I come to think of it, I think there is. But I've got it very, very difficult, not impossible, but very difficult to do this with the keyboard. Mine is Control-Alt-Shift-J, so I've got to do 4 different shifted commands to get this to work, and it's very difficult to do that. And it's with something that I don't normally do with my hand on the stick. So it's a bit of a reach, it's a bit of a stretch, it's awkward, so it's difficult on purpose to get this. This can cause you problems if you trigger this by accident. So either make it difficult or don't bind it at all. There's really no reason to have jettison all cargo bound. Landing gear, you're going to be using this often. Every time you land on the station or on a planet, you're going to need something. G is the most obvious keyboard shortcut for that for me. And a joystick 5. It says 5, but it's on the left. It's on the HOTAS to my left, and it's my mini stick, the button underneath it. And by underneath it, I mean if you press the mini stick, this is how I lower and raise my landing gear. This might seem a little bit awkward for some of you to press. I've got a technique that I use that seems to do just fine without thrusting me in any particular direction. But if that's not comfortable for you, you can always use G for your landing gear. And I also have this bound for voice attack. So I just tell my assistant to do it for me without actually pressing a button. Microphone mute. The game does come with voice communications with friends and squadron members. And it seems a little bit counterintuitive, but this is what it is. It's a mute function, and you can change the way this works from toggling to push to talk and hold, or push to mute and hold. Now, what I've got this set up to do is push to talk, and I've got it bound to my HOTAS so I can work with this on my left hand. That seems to make a lot of sense to me. And I don't want to toggle it. I want it to work as long as the button is held. Again, these are all for your preference, but it's the function you're looking for in order to do a push-to-talk sort of function is microphone mute. That's the function. I know it's kind of counterintuitive and it's a little bit backwards, but this is how it works. This is how they do it. I've also got a keyboard binding bound to it for sake of voice attack, but I don't think they make use of this. Let's see. Shield cell banks are also bound to a joystick and a keyboard shortcut. If I wasn't using W, A, S, and D to do thrust for voice attack, they will actually use those to clear the pad at 30 meters. But if I wasn't using those keys, this would be S and not X. If you're using keyboard and mouse, you're probably going to want to stay away from W, A, S, and D for shield cell, but X seems to make sense to me. It's close to the S. Chaff launcher is C for chaff. ECM is E. Those make sense to me. Now, if you're using keyboard and mouse, those keys in that vicinity on the left edge of the keyboard there probably wouldn't be what you want to use for this. You may want to select something else that makes you more comfortable. But in the meantime, this is what I use. The ECM in particular is a press and hold kind of deal, kind of like the Discovery Scanner is. So you can get the power out of it that you need to do. Again, the shield cell, the chaff launcher, and the ECM can all be bound to a fire group, so you can use one of your primary secondary fires if you want to do that, but I strongly advise against it because they have dedicated keybinds for them. It keeps your fire group selection low, and it keeps the confusion down when you have something that's very specific like this. All ships can equip these. They're not on there by default, but you can equip any of these to any ship, and they're all useful. The shield cell is going to heal you very quickly, but it also generates heat. Your chaff launcher is going to confuse your gimbaled weapons of your attacker, and your ECM is going to confuse any targeted projectiles like missiles or torpedoes. It's going to cause them to. It's like chaff, but for missiles and torpedoes. It does the same thing. I've been told this is useless and you shouldn't bind one of these, but I'm finding it. I don't particularly find it useful at this time, but if you see incoming missile, you may want to think about having these. Context menus need to be on, otherwise things don't work right in game. This is not an option you need to change. And you don't need to bind anything to weapons or engines color. This is a vanity item, and you would equip this in your livery manager when you're setting up your ship. There's no reason to have a keybind associated with this. Night vision, however, is pretty useful, and it makes the outlines of all of your objects visible out to a certain range. It's very useful on dark planets, way far ahead of headlights. You'll see a lot farther with this than you will with the ship's light. So do bind this, and obviously the key that makes the most sense is N for night vision. I don't have it bound to a joystick thing yet because it's about as useful as lights, but it just does a better job. So I have a keyboard binding. It's not so critically important that I have night vision. And this works in space too. You can actually see stations in the dark with this. So if you're in an asteroid field, it's also useful. If you're fighting at night on the dark side of a planet in a ring system, you can have that bound. You don't necessarily need to have it on a joystick, but have it nearby on a key that makes sense to you. Let's close this one and move on to the next. Mode switches. Now this is this is a little bit interesting. This is where things get a little confusing. During the course of your gameplay, you're going to need to look at the left, top, lower, and right context menus in your cockpit in order to get some things done. To do UI focus, this is like similar if you had like a gamepad controller. So pressing the shift key combined with an arrow key up, down, left, or right is going to tell you to look left, look right, and look at those respective panel. And they're not exactly in order here, but they're target, comms, roles, and systems are your 4 panels. Target, comms, role, and systems. The default key bindings for these are 1, 2, 3, and 4 on your alphanumeric keypad at the top of your keyboard. Now, 1 is going to get you to look to the left. 2 is going to get you to look up at your comm panel. 3 is going to get you to look down at your roles panel, so you can do your fighters, your SRVs, and your role as a gunner if you're doing multi-crew. And 4 is going to look at your right-hand panel and give you your systems, your fire groups, your status, your ship systems, your inventory is all going to be on that side. Quick comms, this one also hails from Star Trek Online from me. There's a default key binding, which if you tap the Enter key on your alphanumeric keyboard, you can just start typing in a chat box. So I have this set up similarly to that. Autofocus on text input field, yeah, you want to look at that when you do quick comms. So you can go straight to typing your direction. So shift plus direction is going to get you to look left, right, up, or down. You can also bind 1, 2, 3, or 4. But what I have done on the T16000, there is also a POV hat at the top of the throttle, and left, up, right, or down is going to look at those respective panels just by clicking on that POV hat. That's what I've got bound on the stick. This is what I've got bound on the keyboard so VoiceAttack can use it. And you should be doing this if you're doing mouse and keyboard setup. Or even if you have a stick or one stick, you want to bind some keyboard shortcuts to this because your POV hat on your joystick is going to be set up to do something else. It's going to be navigating through the menus that you're actually selecting with these keys. So one of the POV hats is going to look around and the other one is going to cycle through your menus. Now the next functions in this have more to do with head look or head-mounted displays. At each of these panels, looking in their general direction through standard head looking is going to do nothing. But what you can set it to do is to focus on that panel. It's hard to get out of it when you do that. To me, this is kind of annoying because I want to take a look around and not have that hologram in my way. So this is what we're looking at. I set these up to do nothing until they're focused on by a definitive key press. That's just my preference. You can set these however you like. Enable UI camera lock on. This is, what does this do? When this option is enabled, the camera will turn and lock to a UI panel. That's basically what I was just talking about. If you trigger one of these, your head is going to automatically turn and look directly at that panel just as it should. It's going to lock onto it, so there's no mistake about where you're looking. I would leave this turned on if you're a new player. Galaxy Map, System Map from the games of old. These are going to be on the, I don't have a joystick button set up for these, but from the games of old that have your maps set up for the tab key, I've got my Galaxy Map set up to tab and the System Map set up to shift tab. CQC score screen, I haven't played CQC, so I haven't got anything bound to this. Head look, I've got more than 2 buttons on my mouse, so I've got this bound to mouse button 4. That's gonna, I can click on this and I can basically move my head with the mouse and look around the ship. That's what I want to do. There's some mouse options. I use a toggle. Below this, we have game menu, which is P. Escape does the same thing, so you don't even need to use this. And there's really no reason to bind that, so save yourself a key if you want. Friends menu, you can go directly to that if you want to use a key binding for this, but it's also accessible from the comms menu, so I don't find it necessary to assign a key bind to it. Open Discovery, Control D. These are discoveries of codecs, and they have to do with the way when you make a discovery, that's what this is for. It's going to open the book to what you just discovered. Again, VoiceAttack is sort of screaming for this one, so I have a keyboard bind. Otherwise, you would cycle through your menus to be able to get to the codecs and look at what you've discovered. Switching cockpit mode. What this has to do is switching between combat mode and analysis mode. Combat mode is for your weapons or the things that you would use, obviously, in combat. Analysis mode is going to be reserved for things like the Discovery Scanner, your Composition Scanner, your planetary detailed surface scanner, and the probes. You can only use them in analysis mode. So they've separated some of the modules that you're able to use into 2 different modes. And when you combine things into the same fire group, you may find that you're going to get a persistent message up in the upper right-hand corner of your screen that says you're in the wrong cockpit mode. And that's okay, because you're still using what you want to use in the mode you want to use it in, but you've also tried to trigger something else with the same key that may not be in that mode. So don't let that worry you too much, but that's what this is for, and you should bind it to something that's easy to grab either with your left hand on the keyboard, or if you have a HOTAS. For me, that's bound to the stick. Not the stick, but it's bound to one of the buttons on the throttle, but it's easily accessible for that reason. Enter FSS mode. F is what I've bound to that. I don't have it bound to a joystick key. Again, this is bound to the keyboard because I'm going to move this over here. For me, it's bound to the keyboard because VoiceAttack does what it needs to do with this. I tell her to go look in and to go into FSS mode. FSS is your full spectrum system scanner, and when you're in your full spectrum system scanner, you get a different set of controls. And let's see, where were we? Interface modes. Yeah, when you're in your FSS, you've got a whole... Where is it? Yeah, here's the category that's associated with it. By going into FSS, I'm going to jump ahead real quick just so we cover this. Now you're going to be doing, you're going to be looking through the eye of your sensor in order to view the system. Now I've got my mouse set up to do this, and that seems to make sense for me. That's the fastest way to do it. And I point and I use my left hand to zoom in and out and scan all my targets. But there are other things associated with this. You've got to look around. You've got to zoom in and out. You've got to be able to... what else do you have to do? You got to, yeah, pretty much that's it. You've got to be able to tune your I don't even know what it's called. Your I forget what the thing is called, but it's at the bottom and it sets your tuning so you're picking up the right signature. So you're centered on what you're supposed to be looking at. It tells the difference between gas giants, Earth-likes, rocky bodies, icy bodies, transient signals, etc. And you've got to be able to tune that. So you're going to look around, zoom in and out, and you're going to tune. Those are the basic functions. So what we've got is your camera pitch. I've set this up with the joystick, but I've also enabled the mouse to work with this as well. You can do it with the keyboard as well, up, down, left, and right. You can yaw with this. You can pitch. Those are the two axes you want, or pitch and yaw. You're basically going to be on a fixed position. You're not going to be able to roll because your roll will happen automatically by virtue of moving yourself in a circle on two axes. So your roll is going to change by itself, and you don't get to control that in this. Let's see. Zoom into target. I've got this set to the paddle on the back side of my joystick. You'd probably want to set up a keyboard bind to this. Probably plus and minus on your numpad would work well. Again, we get into the overlapping controls. This is a different mode. You're not flying your ship in this mode, so you can use some controls that you may have already used that seem to make sense when you're controlling the direction of look in something else. So zooming into target and zooming out are two very essential functions of this sensor. Stepped zoom is going to help you declutter a little bit and just sort of get a little bit closer or a little bit farther to help you see your targets a little bit better as you try and do the adaptive zoom. Again, your tuning, I've got this set up on my wheel on my throttle. That gives me an absolute value based on the absolute value of its setting, and its sensitivity is, well, wherever you're comfortable with it. And again, this axis works for me as up is up, down is down, and it works in an inverted fashion because of the way the potentiometer is shaped. The keyboard bindings I have are plus and minus on my alphanumeric pad, and not the numpad, but the alphanumeric pad. And I've got this set just for VoiceAttack. But again, I've got an axis to do that. The discovery scan is important. This is also going to happen inside the FSS just as much as it would if you had selected the fire group and done it before you entered this. And you need to have that bound to a button somewhere. And secondary fire is generally a good option to have. That can be your secondary mouse button, it can be your secondary joystick button, or a keyboard binding of your choice. But whatever you're using to fire, it should be something like your secondary fire. To leave the FSS, to get out of it and get back to your ship, again, this is in the mode, so you're going to overlap this keybind with the same key you used to come out. Probably a good idea to use the same key. That's F for me. So I've got this bound to the keyboard. I usually put all my key bindings on the right side and the joystick bindings on the left. Your mouse axis, again, you're setting this up in the FSS. You're setting up the mouse to work. It's going to use yaw. It's going to move left and right just like you shake your head. Pitch is going to be pitch inverted. That seems to want to work with the mouse normal. I don't know why, but pitch seems to be backwards on the mouse. So inverted seems to be up is up, down is down for me. Relative mouse axis is going to be on. I don't want it to recenter. I want it to stay right where I put it. So this is going to be, I want it to stop moving when I stop moving the mouse. So this is going to be, in this particular instance, that's going to stop the mouse when I stop moving it. Mouse sensitivities at your leisure. Dead zone again at your leisure. Power curve again at your leisure. And what you can also do is if you find something that you like, I have this bound to click on it with the mouse button. And I also have the target, the default target binding, the joystick 3, just like we did in our targeting section above. T is your default keyboard binding for this. But I also have this set to joystick button 3. So whatever I'm pointed at, I can use the stick and lock onto it. This is very useful if you're looking for a signal source and you found your mission objective and you want to lock onto it, but you want to keep scanning. So you select it with this button here. H is going to give you help in the FSS because it can be confusing and overwhelming if you don't know how to use this. It's really not bad. You're basically looking around, zooming in and out, selecting a target, and you're tuning. That's all there is to it. There's a lot of keys in there, but that's really all there is to it. So we were left off at the interface mode. Now this is going to get you around all the menus. Let's see, UI panel up, panel down, panel left, panel right is going to be to actually move the selection up and down. This isn't going to cycle you through the tabs. This isn't going to be what we just did to focus on a panel. This is going to be actually navigating through the panel. And it should be the POV switch on your primary joystick if you have one. If not, it should be a set of arrow keys. And alternatively, in some instances, but not all of them, you can use a mouse. It's important because you're going to do this throughout the entire game, so you need to bind these to something to make sense to you. Again, UI panel select, primary fire. UI back is going to be secondary fire, and I have keyboard shortcuts also assigned to these to backspace and space. UI nested toggle, input for interacting with the main game menus. I'm not quite sure what this does, to be honest, so I haven't bound anything to it. They have some really weird things in this menu that if you bind it, they do weird things. So this one I've never figured out exactly, so I leave it unbound. Never had a problem with it. Next panel tab, I use page up, page down. This is going to get you from navigations to what's it called? Transactions to contacts, and on the right-hand menu, that's going to get you from your status to your inventory to your fire groups to your modules. That's going to navigate you there. For me, I twist my joystick to go left and right on those tabs, and that works with every tab. Now, there's a caveat to these two in particular that if you're in your comms menu and you have some setting set up where you're automatically targeting your text input field, you generally don't want to bind these to a letter because that's going to start typing in that field and sort of lock you into where you want. You're going to wonder why am I putting Q and E in there when I want to shift my tabs? Why am I focused on that automatically? So you're going to have to play with your settings to make it right. But as far as if you're doing a lot of communicating through the text chat, you really want to bind these to something that's going to be like page down or page up and not associated with actually typing in a field. So try and stay away from letters for these. It'd be my recommendation. Your next page is going to be in a display where you have multiple pages of information. Page down, page up makes the most sense on the keyboard, and your mouse will also work in that interface when you're trying to do that. There's going to be arrows you can click on to get to the next page, so you can use either one of those. But that's just navigating menus. Head look mode, you might think this is relevant for VR, and it is, but you can also do head looking with your mouse. So in head look on, we don't want to invert it. We want up is up, down is down. We want to go where the mouse points, or whatever you're comfortable with. You can adjust your sensitivity. You can adjust your default state is on. This will enable mouse head look, but the default state of head look is going to be off. Head look button increments, you can use your arrow keys or your hat switch to sort of move your head a little bit. And you want to accumulate them because if you stop, if it's not on this and it's on like direct, once you stop moving, it's automatically going to snap back to center. And you don't necessarily want that. You want that to be you want it to stay where you put it, and this is the setting that's going to get your head to stay where you put it. Center when system is inactive, yeah, you want that to recenter over time. Or when you, not over time, but when you turn it off, when you toggle your head look off with whatever keybinds you have associated with it, that will cause it to look straight ahead once you turn it off, and that's a good feature to have turned on. Head look smoothing would be good, otherwise it gets to be, if you have a high refresh monitor, you might turn this off. It'd be a lot more direct without having this, but it's smoother while having this on. It sort of has a little bit of momentum to it, takes some getting used to, but this is one of those things, if you're looking around, you should probably turn that on and just sort of be ginger about your mouse. There's a button I have bound to reset it. I can sort of look to the center by hitting my mouse button number 5. You don't have to have this bound. Your reset HMD button will do the same thing, but not in head look. So this is just if you've toggled this on and you're using your mouse for it. Looking up, looking down, looking left, and looking right, I've got bound to the POV hats and nothing else. But again, the mouse works for this, so these are sort of irrelevant. It's nice to have these bound. So if I happen to have it turned on, I can use the joystick if my hand is not on the mouse. So it comes in handy as a secondary thing, but they're not by any means required. The axis also has a dead zone adjustment to it, so you can do your dead zone wherever you like. If I've got an axis. I don't have an axis on mine because it's bound to the mouse and the POV hat and not to the joystick. So that would get really confusing if you did that. So you generally want to stick to keys, buttons, or the mouse, but stay away from your joystick inputs because that's really going to mess you up. Okay. Moving on to the Galaxy map, this is a tough one to explain. You're going to be in a 360-degree 3D environment in your Galaxy map. I've got this, of course, bound to the mouse, and it's tough to explain because you're going to use a combination of mouse buttons to drag the map in a certain way. But it also works for me with the joystick. So I've got pitch axis is y-axis inverted, just like usual. Nose down for up, nose up for down. That works for me. I've got it also bound to the keypad. X-axis is going to yaw left and right. I'm going to do my head shaking motion just like that on the map. I want it to rotate around the center point using the x-axis as yaw. And it's going to be inverted because you're looking at your point in a third person. So if I want to move left, it's going to basically take the whole map and rotate it right. It's not going to make sense at first, but it will when you use this. It seems backwards, but trust me on this, this is correct. If you move the stick if you move the stick left, it's going to turn the view to the left, and it's going to seem like the entire map is sliding to the right or rotating to the right. And it is, but you're changing where you're looking. You think of yourself as the thing that's moving and not the galaxy that's moving. So don't think of the map as the moving thing. Think of yourself and think of the camera as the thing that's moving. Again, I got those bound to keys. And let's see, Galaxy Cam Translate axis. This is going to be on my mini stick on the left side. So I'm going to change by translating. I'm going to move the whole map vertically up and down. I'm going to move my viewpoint vertically without changing the attitude. And that's the translate axis. Same with the x-axis. I'm going to slide that map sideways. And wait a second. No, this is going to be z-axis. So yeah, so x and y, I'm going to be able to move this map forward and back, not up and down. I'm sorry, these controls are confusing me now. Yeah, so this is going to be forward and back, not up and down. Forward and back, this one's going to be. So we're going to slide across the plane of the galaxy with this axis right here, forward and back, and left and right with this one, relative to where you're looking. And my translate z-axis, my up and down, believe it or not, I've got this one bound to the rudder pedal. So my right rudder is going to move it up, and my left rudder is going to move this down. You don't have to bind these, guys. Your mouse will do everything you need it to do here, but I've got these all bound up just for posterity's sake. Don't let this confuse you. Your mouse is going to do everything you need to do. So let's see. Zoom axis, and I've got this set to the RZ axis, which is the paddle on the back of my throttle, so I can zoom in plus and zoom out minus. And the correct control for more or less is going to be inverted on this. So pay attention to these guys. The X and Y axis on the translation axis are going to be inverted because you're thinking backwards now. You're thinking of your camera as the thing that's moving, not the map, and you're actually moving the map with this. So it's going to be backwards based on how you think on it. It's hard to explain, but it comes to pass. You're just going to have to play with this and set these how you like. Let's see. Y to Z axis, I've got a toggle for this that I never use. Galaxy Cam zoom in and zoom out. I've got a mouse wheel for this, and I'm trying to think if I've got... I know the mouse works. For some reason, I don't have any bindings for it, but basically the way it works is I can move the cursor around the map in the Galaxy map without moving the map and pick and choose and select something. If I click and drag with my right mouse button, I'm going to be able to yaw my camera around the point and move the map up or down with vertical movement of the mouse. And with my left mouse button, I'm going to be able to swing the camera left and right, and I'm going to be able to change the pitch on the camera by dragging with my left mouse button. And if I click both mouse buttons and drag, I can then translate and drag the entire map in the direction of the mouse. Again, you're going to have to play with this, but you can use one, the other, or both to get what you need out of the mouse and the Galaxy map. So this is a very confusing control set, guys, and it's very tough to explain, but like I keep saying, you're just going to have to play with it and get this where you're comfortable using it. It's going to seem frustrating at first, but these are your axes. So I'm going to go over these one more time just to be clear. Your pitch axis is going to be your joystick Y-axis. That's going to be looking up, looking down against the plane of the star system. Your yaw axis is going to swing you around the camera point. Your translate axis is going to actually slide you forward or back. Your translate left and right axis are going to slide you left. It slides you left and right without actually changing your direction. Your translating Z-axis is your height. That's your elevation on the plane of the stars, plane of the galaxy. And that, for me, again, is bound to my rudder pedals. And you're going to drag the right mouse button up and drag with the right mouse button to get that to work with the mouse. Once again, my pitch is inverted. My pitch is inverted. My yaw is inverted because we're thinking of something else other than the camera. I'm sorry, other than the map, that's the moving thing. You don't think of the map as the thing that moves. Think of the camera as the thing that moves. And the zoom axis is also going to be inverted because the rudder pedals work backwards by default. So, wow. So Galaxy Cam Select Current System, this is a hotkey to get you to where you are currently sitting in the Galaxy. And that is letter C, to center. You can bind this to anything you want. When you're in the Galaxy map, you're not controlling your ship. So this is one of those key binds you can combine with something else. You'll recall this was bound to chaff earlier, but this is a different mode that you're in. Tough one to get through, guys, I know. Driving, your SRV is up next. It's very similar to what you're going to be doing to fly. Drive assist, I have this off by default because the throttle does weird things. If you don't, it's something I'm comfortable with. And it works with my toe brakes on my rudder pedals in a fashion that is... fashion that's more consistent. So when I take my foot off the gas, the vehicle stops applying thrust. That's what drive assist off does for me. So I have this set to off. I get a warning message in my HUD, but this is set to off. Steering mouse axis is off. Steering mouse X-axis is relative axis is off. I do not steer the SRV with a mouse. If you're playing keyboard and mouse, you're probably going to be better off driving this thing with a keyboard than you would ever be with a mouse. It's just odd. Try it, see if you like it, but for me, I would use a keyboard to drive this thing. Steering axis for me is going to be my joystick, X-axis, main stick, left and right. Got some keyboard bindings for left and right steering as well. Roll axis. Roll is the same thing as your steering axis. The only difference is when you're airborne, your SRV's got thrusters, and you can actually control your roll. You want this to sort of roll out onto whatever ground you think you're going to land on. So yeah, you can actually technically fly the SRV with these controls. And these change automatically. If you're on the ground, you're going to be moving the wheels. If you're in the air, you're going to be applying thrusters. And it happens automatically. So bind these to the same X-axis. So I've got these bound as well to the keypad. Your pitch axis, of course, is going to be your y-axis. It does nothing for thrust, but you fly the SRV when you're in the air, and you use the y-axis on your joystick, forward and back, inverted, just like you would in your ship. Pull up, push down, and you fly this thing when it's in the air to align it to where you think you're going to land if you're up in the air. Again, keyboard bindings are applied, and I would strongly recommend doing this for keyboard and mouse players. I strongly recommend keyboard for this. Now, I'm using the numpad as an example. You can use whatever you're comfortable with, but that's what makes sense to me. Vertical thrusters. That's going to be the same as your boost button. That's going to be if you want to get your SRV to jump and pop straight up in the air, this is what you do. I use the same key that I use for boost, which is joystick 3 on my HOTAS. And whatever you've got applied to it, for me on the keyboard, it's going to be num0. You can use a mouse key for this. If you've got more than 2 buttons, you can do that. Primary fire, same thing, joystick 1, joystick 2. Space, shift space for the keyboard. And then there's a handbrake. This is basically lock up all the wheels, don't let them rotate. And I've got that bound to a joystick button. Number 4, that's on top. That would be the same button I would ordinarily use to cycle through fire groups. But since I'm in a vehicle, it's a different keybind. And I've got that there because you don't need more than 1 fire group in an SRV. You've got a weapon, you've got sensors. That's all there is. There's no heat sinks, there's no chaff launchers, there's no ECMs, there's no shield cells, there's nothing, there's no utilities. It's just your weapons and your sensors. So you really only need 1 fire group. You should not be cycling fire groups in your SRV. If you are, you're doing it wrong. So set your handbrake up to something that's going to be meaningful and nearby your steering. Headlights are very relevant in an SRV. A lot of the time, you're going to be in a dark environment. You do have the night vision bound to N, just like before. That's applicable to both the SRV and the ship, and it's functional in both vehicles, in all vehicles, actually. So that button should be a pretty universally applicable function. Headlights work a little bit differently in the SRV than they do in the ship. You have a low beam setting and a high beam setting. They call them something different. I think they have like spot beam and flood beam or something like that. But anyway, it's basically low and high. And your lights key, whatever it is, in my case it's L and a joystick button. And for me, this is a utility, so it's going to be on the right side of my stick. And it's going to toggle through off, low, high every time you hit that button. Toggle SRV turret. Now, I've got this bound to the mini stick. Button 6 on my HOTAS. So that's going to be the button I depress on the mini stick to do the landing gear in the ship. And in this case, it's going to pop the turret out because I'm going to use the mini stick to aim the turret. And the turret's aim is going to be where you look at all times. You can steer your SRV, but your POV is going to be wherever your turret is looking, and you control it. This gets really confusing, guys, because if you've got a HOTAS, you're steering the SRV with your stick, and you're steering your turret with your other hand simultaneously. So you're kind of like doing and I don't know how old some of you guys are, but if you've ever seen the movie Total Recall where the guy's steering the cab with 2 steering wheels, that's kind of what it's like in an SRV. So it might be one of those things you might want to stop, then aim, then move, then stop, then aim, then move, and then do what you need to do there. But for me, I've got a mini stick applied to it, but you can also do it with the keyboard. I've got it set up to the enter key on the numpad, and to fire groups are set up just like they would be before, but they're not usable because there's only 1. And let's see. Driving targeting is going to be where we get into how you aim the SRV. There's a lot of keybinds here, guys, but it's really not that bad. We're talking about axial control here. So selecting target ahead, same deal. That's going to be joystick button 3 for me. The default key binding is T for targeting. I've got that set up for voice attack. Driving turret controls, here we go. Your mouse X-axis is going to move your turret left and right. Again, just like you're shaking your head, that's going to be the best thing you can do. That's the only thing you can do, as a matter of fact. Relative mouse axis you want on. When you stop moving your axis, you want the turret to stay where you put it, and that's how you do it. Pitch axis should be, you have off pitch and inverted for your Y-axis. Again, up is up, down is down. Pitch regular is what you want. Relative mouse axis, again, is on. When you stop moving your mouse, the turret stops moving. So you don't need to recenter your mouse to stop it from moving. Once you stop moving your mouse, it stops moving the turret. So let's see. Yaw axis and pitch axis, again, these are the axes that control it with the joystick. This is going to be, these two axes, X and Y, are the mini stick on the throttle to my left. And I have no key bindings bound to these because that's even more weird. So up is up, down is down. In order to do that, the Y-axis is going to be inverted. It just works for me. Play with these until you get them to where you want. No key bindings for pitch up, pitch down, but you can do this. But if you're already driving the thing, again, you're going to be driving it with, you're going to be flying it on 3 axes plus trying to steer your turret. Good luck with that, doing it with a keyboard, guys. Use the keyboard to drive the thing and stay stationary and shoot what you need to shoot. That would be my best recommendation. Your controls do not change if you're in a turret. All of your firing controls, all of your SRV controls are basically going to be what they're going to be, but your point of view is not going to be in the driver's seat. It's going to be up top at the turret. And to answer your questions in advance, no, you can't multi-crew in an SRV and have somebody else be your gunner. It doesn't work that way. Let's see. Power curve, dead zone, sensitivity are all at your discretion. Make it be comfortable for you, but that turret is a very important part of the SRV, so do set up your controls so they work. Get down on a planet, land it, drive it away from your ship, and play with these controls until they work the way you want them to, but do play with them and get them to work the way you want them to. Driving throttle, similar to where the ship is. I've got my throttle set up for this. Drive speed axis is going to be my Z-axis. Inverted makes the throttle work correctly for me. Forward only is the range. I've got a reverse toggle just like I do in the ship. This is set up exactly the way it is in the ship, so your controls aren't any different. I want the throttle increments to be continuous, and I can use W and S to accelerate and decelerate if I want to use the keyboard and the stick for it. I've also got joystick RX and RY. We haven't seen these axes yet as we talked about this, but these two are my rudder pedals. So the X axis is going to be my right rudder pedal toe brake, just like I'm stepping on the gas pedal or the brakes in a car, and the Y axis is going to be the left rudder pedal. So one's the gas, one's the brake. And the brake, once you stop, will send you in reverse. So for maneuvering and scooping, I typically cut the throttle back and use these, just go back and forth real quick with my feet. That's a nice feature if you've got rudder pedals, but if you don't have those, you can always use W and S on the keyboard and mix your left hand with your right hand as far as your steering controls go. That would be the best way to do this. Again, I do not recommend trying to steer this thing with a mouse. It can be done, but I do not recommend it. Moving on, driving miscellaneous. So you've got your same power allocations just like they are on the ship, up, down, left, right, weapons, systems, engines, balance, power. They work the same way they do in the ship with the same bindings they do in the ship, and the cargo scoop is the same deal, same bindings. Jettison all cargo. You do have a 2-ton limit in the SRV Scarab, so you really want that to be bound to something that's very difficult or not at all. There is no reason to do this, although it's a lot less of a headache in an SRV because it's only 2 tons, and most of the time the cargo that you drop won't degenerate like it does in space. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. But if it's a canister, chances are it's going to have a persistent lifespan. It's not going to degenerate on a planet like it will in space. Recalling and dismissing the ship is a good idea, and I want to talk about this feature for just a second here. I don't want to dive into it too deep, but I actually don't want that bound to R. I have a key binding for this already, and I don't need 2 key bindings for it. So home is what's going to do it for me for this particular function. What this is going to do is launch your ship into orbit so it's not on the ground. What I tell people that ask about this when they say, oh my God, I'm stuck on a planet with in my SRV, how do I get my ship back? This is the function you want to bind. It will bring your ship back to you, or it will send it away from you. And there's a few things to discuss about this. If you drive a distance of more than 2 kilometers away from your ship, it will dismiss itself automatically. It's not just going to stay where you put it. It's going to go automatically. You can also recall and dismiss it if you're in a hostile zone. You want your ship to leave. And what I tell people is when they say, where does it go? I say, it goes into safe space. No one can see it in orbit. No one can attack it from the planet. No one can attack it from the sky. You can't get it into combat. It's going to remain unattended, but no one is going to see it. It goes into safe space and it's stowed away from any danger. And that's what this function does. It's very useful. If you're in a hostile area, you want your ship to leave immediately, great. You get out of your settlement, you're getting shot at, you're more than 2.5 kilometers out of the settlement, you've driven forever and you're still getting shot at. You want that ship to come pick you up, slap this key, and it'll come back down to you. It does take about a minute and a half for it to come down and land, which can be an eternity if you're getting shot at, but this is the thing. It will tell your ship to come down and do a simple landing maneuver. So this is a very important thing to have bound. But the rest of it, like I said, it's all default controls, just like, not default controls, but it's the same setup as you would have in your ship for power transfers and the cargo scoop and the jettison command. So same stuff. You're in different vehicles, same commands. You just have to bind them a second time. So don't let it be too intimidating. We've got the same sort of mode switching and panel switching that we do in the SRV as we do in the ship. And they're going to be, again, bound the same way. For me, this is going to be the POV hat on my throttle. And UI shift plus direction is going to give you your panels one way or the other. 1, 2, 3, and 4 are the default key bindings for left, right, up, and down panels. And again, quick comms is going to be your enter key. That's going to be something that makes sense. Hit enter, start typing, hit enter again, send your message. This way here, you don't have to open your comms menu. System map and galaxy map, there's really no point in opening these in the SRV because you ain't going anywhere system or galaxy wide when you're stuck on a planet subjected to its gravity. You can fly it off a planet, but yeah, no. So you don't have to bind these here, but if you want to take a look around and get information from the map, you certainly can. Just don't expect to plot a route. So tab for your galaxy map, shift tab for your system map. Again, hailing from the games of old, that's where the map used to be, is toggled onto tab. And for Discovery Codex, again, Control D, same as in the ship, like we talked about above. Cockpit mode can also be switched from combat to analysis. You do have, like I said, sensors and weapons, and you do need to switch cockpit modes to use them appropriately. So you should have a button set up to toggle. And head look, again, for me, is mouse 4. You can set this up as your leisure. It would help you to be able to look around in your SRV while you're driving so you don't have to turn your whole vehicle to look at what you want to look at. You can stop, turn your head to the right by using your mouse and using a button on the mouse or a keybind to toggle this. See the plus sign next to it? Again, we can set this to toggling. Multi-crew. This was one, unless you've got a buddy that's got a good setup for this, you really don't need to worry about these key bindings right away. But when you get into multi-crew, and if you find a friend with a big ship with lots of turrets for you to work with and a fighter for you to fly, you're going to want to think about this because the interface works a lot differently than you might think. The mode toggle is if you're sitting on the bridge of the ship, and this is going to change your radar. It's going to be, I believe it's going to change your radar. It's been a minute since I've done multi-crew, but I've got this set up for the mouse because of the way the gunner roll works. And this is like the only thing that does third-person camera aside from the camera suite in this game. It's the only way they can really make you look around outside the ship at your targets, and it's a simulated view. It's kind of hard to justify with a first-person perspective throughout the entire game, but this is how it works. So the mode, this is going to switch you between radar modes. You're going to be able to look at the ship's status, or you're going to be able to select your roles from your panels. Your primary fire, joystick 1 or mouse 1. Again, I use mouse looking for the gunner roll, so I use mouse 1, mouse 2, and the utility fire would, for me, be clicking on mouse 3, which is the mouse wheel. I would click that. Utility fires are 3 and joystick 2, but I guess these are, I think these are on my left, on my throttle, if I remember correctly. This joystick 2 and 3, because they're overlapping, can't have two of them in the same category. So I assume these are on, because again, I haven't done this in a while, but these are on my throttle if I'm not mistaken. But utility firing, I've never had to use this in multi-crew. Usually the pilot's going to use his own utilities to his satisfaction, keep his shields up, keep enemies off of him. He's the pilot. He's going to assess the combat situation, and he's going to countermeasure accordingly. So I wouldn't worry about utility fires. You can get control of the utilities if your pilot feels more comfortable handling the weapons, and you can be the guy that does defense, and you can bind these to your mouse buttons or joystick buttons appropriately. But for me, I've got these bound to my throttle. Your mouse x-axis is it's going to do the yaw, so it's going to shake your head left and right, just like you're saying no to somebody. Your relative mouse axis is going to be off. I don't want it to center horizontally. This is going to go where the ship looks, and for these are going to be a little bit different than we've been setting them before. For you to stop moving and let the ship rotate around your camera, this needs to be off for both axes, even though we've had it on for other settings. This is something you're going to need to play with to get it to where you want it. But for me, to get my camera to stop moving after I stop moving my mouse in multi-crew, in gunner mode, these need to be set to off. I have pitch set to regular, so it's up is up, down is down. I usually do that for mouse controls, and the joystick is usually the thing that I invert. So pitch is regular on this. Third person yaw axis. Is going to be the joystick axis. And you can also set keyboard bindings to these if you really want to use keyboard. I'm trying to think about these because it's been a minute since I've done multi-crew. Field of view axis is going to be the throttle for me. So that is going to be, just to make sure, that's the same thing I had bound. So joystick U axis is the throttle on the stick, not the throttle to the left, but the throttle on the stick. I can also manually control that with the mouse Z-axis, which is the mouse wheel, up and down. So if I pull the mouse wheel back, it's going to zoom out. Move it forward, it's going to zoom in. And cockpit UI, forwards and backwards, this is going to change page 1 and 2 in the radar. If you're wondering, you're looking at that thing, how do I get over there? Set up these key bindings, and that's what this does. So for me, this is going to be what my subsystem targeting would normally be in the ship, and it's going to be my greater than, less than symbols on the keyboard. This is all going to make a lot more sense when you do this, guys. Again, multi-crew, not a high priority if you're a new player. Set this up and play with it with your multi-crew partner when you set it up, just so you know how everything works. This is something you want to play with. Fighter orders. If you have a ship that can support a fighter, you've got some key bindings that can help you out. I've got these sort of set in such a way that came from Star Trek Online and manipulating your NPC crew members. So I have F8 set to recall in order to come back. Actually, these are fighter commands that would be on a carrier just as much as they would be an NPC crew member. We have defensive posture, which is F6. Engage at will, which is any target of opportunity, which is F7. And to focus on my target is going to be F5. Now again, I have voice attack set up to handle these commands, so I can tell it what I want without having to worry about which one's which, but these make sense to me. Attack, defend, fire at will, and come home are in order on the F keys, F5 through F8. I've already dealt with F1 through F4 for friendly targeting, although F4 isn't used for anything. Maintaining formation is going to be Shift F. Hold position is going to be Shift X. That keybind comes again from Star Trek Online. X marks the spot is the logic behind that particular keybind. I want you to stay right there. So I have that set to the X key, Shift X. Follow me is Control F. Follow and formation, you need to differentiate these for yourself. These work for me, set them where you want. And to open orders, I have that set to a joystick keybind so I can go directly to this menu by the single flick of a switch. Pretty simple menu. You set it where you're comfortable with. Again, not a high priority unless you are hell-bent on setting up a fighter on your ship. There's only about 9 or 10 ships that can support a fighter at this time in the game out of the 37 that they have available, so this is not a priority. Make this a priority after you start getting your ship stature up a little bit and you've learned all the rest of this stuff. Camera suite, same deal. Don't worry about the machinima. Guys, I can't even explain this to you except These are your views, 1 through 9. Order them however you want. I've got a toggle to enter free camera and switch away from being able to control the ship. And your axes are going to control your camera view. Page up, page down is going to cycle through your cameras. That's the suite. When you're in free camera, you get a new set of bindings. You can turn off the HUD. You can increase or decrease your speed. And set that up for how well the camera moves. I don't have these bound. I don't make a lot of machinima with this, so I don't have all these bound. Forward axis is going to be the throttle. It's going to be full range on this one because I have a HOTAS. I have a reverse toggle, which we don't want to use. I have a mouse 1 and mouse 2 to move in and out, or forward and backward for the camera. Lateral axis is not actually bound. Moving right and left is set to strafe, D and A, and I also have some move up and down set to W and S, and my mouse is going to handle pitch and yaw. And for whatever reason, I have to invert pitch on this to make it work correctly. I don't know why, but this setting for me is up is up, down is down, as always in the mouse. Otherwise, it is backwards. So that's the camera suite. Set your sensitivities at your leisure and your key bindings at your leisure if you want to do this with a keyboard or joystick or another input device. That's what all this is. Q and E I also have set up to roll left and right. Those are the only things I found relevant. I only need one set of controls to work the camera suite, and these are them. I don't use this very heavily, so I don't have a lot of the keybinds filled out. Stabilizer on or off toggle. Toggle between the camera rotating with the ship and rotating independently. You can lock the camera to the ship with the rotation. You can set up a keybind to toggle that. Again, I don't have one bound. It's not the most important thing. I have a mouse button set up to toggle between camera and ship control so I can fly the ship when I'm in third person. We can also detach and reattach the camera and move it around. We can back out of free camera with a backspace key. We can zoom and blur with mouse 3. It's the scroll wheel, so we're going to set zoom and blur with the mouse wheel. And you use the mouse wheel button as the toggle for that. That seems to make a lot of sense. Apologies, my throat is getting dry talking about all this. Zoom and focus, again, is going to be mouse up, mouse down. That's these two bindings here. And blur is going to be plus and minus on the keyboard by itself. Now, you can toggle between these two so the mouse wheel works them, but this is an independent control. You're going to have to play with these to get where you want to be. I would not recommend this as a new player. Get a grip on the regular controls before you enter the camera suite or free camera. To get into this, I've got these key bindings set to, and I forgot to cover this, but to get into the camera suite for either of these, it's Control-Alt-Space. That's what the debug camera used to be before they actually introduced the camera suite as a usable tool. And that is what I have been using to get into the camera. So Hollow Me, again, not a lot. You just drag it around with a mouse. There's not much in there. You can toggle mouse rotation with your left shift. What this is how you create your character. And there's key bindings for it. Not the most important thing, but if you want to create your character, bind a couple of keys so you can move around. Playlist bindings I've bound to some alternate arrow controls, even though the arrows are bound to the power management systems. I also have them bound to playlists. So play pause is going to be alt up, forward is going to be alt right, backwards is going to be alt left, and clear the queue is going to be alt down. Those are the controls that make sense to me in terms of dealing with play, pause, forward, backward. FSS we already talked about. I did that before. Detailed Surface Scanner is going to be a module that you equip to your ship. The FSS is included in every ship so you can discover all your planets and scan for everything you need to scan. The Detailed Surface Scanner is a module that you can equip, and it's going to tell you all of your points of interest on a planet. It's not going to tell you the composition. You'll get this by using your FSS. and zooming in on a target, then you'll get all of the things that that planet contains, all of the elements that are on it and whatnot. That comes from this, if I'm not mistaken. If I am mistaken, do feel free to correct me in the comments below, but this, I believe, gives you all of your planet's composition right here once you scan it. If you want to find something specific, like a geyser or a human structure or whatever else that's on there in particular, some exact point of interest on the planet, you use the detailed surface scanner, which uses probes and pings the planet's surface in a wide range in like a crater format. And to do this, you can actually lob these probes around the backside of a planet so you don't actually have to travel around it to shoot probes at it. There's also an efficiency bonus. If you can do it with fewer than the probes required, you get a bonus when you turn in your exploration data. As far as using fewer probes than required, you're saving resources. They give you a bonus. They pay you extra. So toggle front and back view, I've got this set up to a press and hold button on my joystick. It's joystick 4 when I'm in there. I can control the viewing with the joystick X-axis and Y-axis, as well as the mouse. I can look around with the mouse on this one. Joystick 2 would be your backspace button, same deal, and that will back you out of the detailed surface scanner module. For the mouse, your left and right is going to be your yaw, your up and down is going to be your pitch, regular, up is up, down is down. For this, your relative mouse axis needs to be on in order to stop the camera from moving when you stop your mouse from moving. You'll note that some of these we talked about before were off and some of them were on. I am telling you what is correct for if you stop moving the mouse and your camera stops moving. That's what these need to be right here. That is like, it's stopping your cursor from going across the screen without you having to recenter the mouse. It's hard to explain the relative axis, but basically when you stop moving your mouse, your camera stops moving. And it doesn't go back to where you put it, it stays where you put it. DSS mount sensitivity at your leisure. Third person view, yaw axis. Again, we're going to bind this to the joystick. The yaw axis, the Y axis, yaw starts with Y. This is going to be regular, and for some reason this seems to work. I think this is up is up, down is down for this, and it's not an inverted pitch axis. That seems to work better for me when I'm operating this sensor. It seems to make more sense. But left, right, down, up arrows will also work in these key bindings. And the field of view is going to be, for me, the stick throttle. In order for that throttle to work correctly, it needs to be inverted. Up is in, out is down. That needs to be inverted for that to happen. Third-person field of view in and out can also be bound to keybinds if you don't already have them bound to an axis or in addition to an axis. That is what we learned here. So, a lot of key bindings to talk about, a lot of functions to talk about, nothing in depth. We're not getting into game in this video to talk about any of these features unless you all have questions and you want me to go into depth on these features and how they work and what they do. I'd be more than happy to make tutorial videos about that. But until then, I want you to take from this video this bare minimum thing. After all of that talking, take this from this video, and that is if you're going to do anything before you start flying, make sure you set up your flight rotation and flight thrust. If you can't move your ship, you can't play this game, guys. These are the two bare minimums right here, and everything else is at your leisure. These need to be here. Flight throttle is also a good one, but this will get you up, down, forward, backwards, left, right, yaw, pitch, roll. This will get you all of your stuff. Keyboard and mouse is one of the most dangerous players in the game. Don't be afraid to try it, but enjoy it. The game is best enjoyed with a HOTAS, but will work with a joystick just the same. Find the stick with controls on the keyboard with your left hand. You can pull this off with a minimum level of hardware, but the thing you should be doing, guys, this is the first thing you should be doing, is going through all of these controls before you even attempt the tutorial missions. Get up here, click this on empty, and set these controls manually so they make sense to you. If you set them, you'll remember what they are. I made some changes to mine, so I'm going to apply those changes. And that's going to do it for this video, guys. Thanks for watching, and I hope this helps you if you're a new player. I'm Scoob. We'll catch you on the flip side.